Tropico 5. Yes, this is a series that I've been struggling to get excited about more recently. I didn't help that Tropico 4 was pretty damn similar to 3, but I think my big problem across the board, the Tropico problem, is the fact that I have a lot of fun with these games to start with, and then I get comfortable with how the gameplay works. I figure out what I need to do with the industry to kind of min-max how much money I'm making, and how to get around pissing off either the US or the USSR and kind of stay under their radar and prosper with both of them feeling fairly neutral towards me. And that happens in most Tropico games I've played, and that kind of sucks because a lot of the fun stuff in these games is designed around when you've pissed off one of the major factions or you've made a big mistake and seeing the reactions to that. If you get too gamey about it and play it like a strategy game, which you are encouraged to do, let's be honest, it loses that, and it loses that appeal, which is a shame because I like the setting. I think they've done a great job of managing to be inspired by, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War, and yet have a really funny and witty game as a result. I like it. I just wish it didn't have that recurring problem. So I went along to this preview event for Tropico 5, and that was actually the first thing they brought up pretty much when I sat down. They said that we want players to have to reinvent how they go about the game as they play. We don't want them to be comfortable, which is exactly what I wanted to hear. Unfortunately, it was a hands-off preview event, and even if it was hands-on, you'd have to play it for at least, 3 or 4 hours until you start to really see that, if I'm honest. But yes, it's nice to hear exactly what I wanted them to say as we arrived. So yeah, how are they going about that? The main way they're pushing it is through this eras system. So in past games, it's been focused on the Cold War, and Tropico 5 is spread out much further than that. You start off in the colonial era, you then go through to the World Wars, then the Cold War, then the 21st century. And the game changes apparently quite drastically with each of these eras. Once again, I saw very precisely crafted save games that the lead developer was walking us through, so it's hard to get a real impression of that. I'm just saying what was suggested as we were looking at it, and as the best we can do at this stage. But you start off in the colonial era, and your priorities there, you're not even the presidente at that point, you're an elected governor, you're working for the crown, and you're looking to get independence at some point. And you can either go about that by paying off or fighting against the crown, which are both, you'd imagine, difficult things to do, things you won't be able to do straight away. And so you have to start off by kind of keeping the crown happy, fitting their needs while slowly working towards independence whilst they're not looking. And that's done through kind of quests that they give you, or objectives that they set you, I guess is a better way of describing it. And there'll be things like build this to improve your economy, and build this to start researching. And I think they're going to use that as a kind of kind of a tutorial, kind of a beginning, making sure that your city is shaping in the correct way. And then they start to ask more and more of you, and things you don't want to give over. They'll start asking for more taxes, and then you start thinking, you know what, this whole me working for the crown thing ain't such a good idea. So that's how it starts, and those are your initial objectives. And then as you move into the World Wars era actually, you've got opposing factions that will want different things from you. I imagine that will work similar to the US and USSR in past games, but we didn't really see too much of that particular section of the game. And yeah, the idea is that every time you enter a new era, the factions will want very different things from you. And in fact, they were talking about the colonial era in particular. The moment you gain independence, you progress to the next, to the World Wars. So if you do it too quickly, you could end up in the World Wars era with an economy that can't really sustain it. Or if you do it too late, you'll be, in debt to the crown, or your revolutionary faction within your own population may have rebelled against you. And so you have to kind of manage that and pick the right time to go after independence. But yeah, they talked about the fact that just in terms of how you keep the factions happy, you're going to have to constantly change your approach to that. It sounds right. Does that sound drastically different to what we were doing in past games? Maybe. We'll have to see. Some of the other things, though, on outside of the kind of the big diplomacy, you've got things like your economy. Well, the resources change in value throughout the game and change and spike during certain eras. They mentioned steel during the World Wars will be very valuable, but that will then peak and start to diminish. So it may make a lot of sense to put your entire industry into steel at one point in the game, but then switch entirely out of it later on. And I hope that's the case because, you don't want to get comfortable. Comfortable is the enemy of Tropico as far as I'm concerned. Outside of that, there's also, just within the kind of global trading system they've got going on, there'll be certain trade windows, certain time windows in which resources are very valuable. So even I imagine that kind of the steel within the World Wars is a large arc that spans over that era, whereas there'll be lots of these little time windows in between that. That's the impression I got anyway. So yeah, you'll be having to change that infrastructure on a regular basis if you want to make as much money as possible. I did have a concern that, as the eras progress and you'll unlock new buildings and new technology as you go along, will it just be a case of, right, let's scrap all the colonial buildings now and just build the World War equivalents? I brought that up because that sounds like a really, really dull way of going about it. And they said that's not necessarily the way you'll want to play it because certain buildings adapt and their uses change as the eras progress. One kind of nifty example they gave was in the colonial era, you may want to build a military fort. It's very expensive, but a really good way of gaining independence if you choose to fight against the crown. So it costs you a lot of money, but it's really, really useful. After you've got independence, you may not be facing the same kind of threats, and so it becomes less and less useful, but is still very expensive to maintain. Up until a certain point when it actually becomes a tourist attraction because it's got history surrounding it, and people want to come and have a nosy round because castles are bloody cool to walk around anyway. And yeah, so maybe by the 21st century, it's actually starting to pay for itself again. I like that idea. I like a lifespan, a changing lifespan for these buildings. So it just doesn't seem that you have to, start again as each era begins. With some of the basic buildings, they showed the kind of colonial housing, the very basic, rudimentary housing that you can begin with, is obviously not going to be as, as efficient as the latest stuff, but does have an advantage in the fact that they're self-sufficient. If you put residents in a colonial house or a certain type of colonial house that's available, they can grow their own food and they don't need to get it from elsewhere. So even later down the line, maybe you've got like an outpost where you've got an oil rig or something. That housing may be more useful to you than building, the new flash stuff and having to provide electricity and a whole infrastructure around that. So hopefully that's the case. It would be a much more interesting way to go about it. And the save files they did show us, we kind of saw the progression of one island through the different eras. Obviously, they've been chosen by the developers. It's hard to know exactly how much this can compare to your experience with the game. But, even by the 21st century, they were still using some of the colonial buildings and they still did provide a use. So that sounds cool. That sounds what I was hoping to hear. Yes, what else will change? Obviously, you've got, your internal factions pop up with different demands, and that different factions may be more aggressive in certain eras. Like you'll have the revolutionaries when when you haven't declared independence against the crown. The revolutionaries will pressure you into doing that. They may not be as prevalent later down the line, but that's not really the stuff they delved in too much. I did like the idea of a player-chosen constitution, so you can set the laws and the way that your political system works for your island, and these things have short-term effects, which you'd expect, but some really interesting long-term repercussions by the sounds of it. So what the example we were looking at was the voting. You can basically choose, whether or not people have the right to vote. If you want to be a proper dictator, you may well just say, sod voting. That's never helped anyone. I'll just be in charge from now on, all right? But you could also say maybe only male people can vote because you're a bad person. And as a result, obviously the female part of your population will become very unhappy and maybe start to look for some kind of revolution. But there's a long-term effect, which you wouldn't necessarily expect straight away. The militarist faction becomes more influential, because that's made up of mainly male members of your population, and you're giving them more political influence by only letting male people vote. So that's kind of something you wouldn't have expected. As you put that into place, you'd be more worried about the short-term effects. I like that there's long-term stuff as well. And yeah, something maybe you've declared that in the colonial era, and by the time you get to the Cold War, it's a really big problem because you haven't changed and adapted as you've gone along. I hope that's the case, and that's all I can really say as we go through this video, because it was a hands-off preview event, and yes, we'll have to wait until we get to play the game for ourselves to really see how well these ideas have been put into place. There were a couple of things that have been added which I'm not quite so keen about. I love the stuff that making the game a little bit more, not necessarily more difficult, but making sure that the difficulty remains throughout the entire game, rather than spiking at the beginning and then dropping down. However, they have also added a couple of things. They've added dynasty options. So your Presidente will have a family, and you will be able to give them certain actions, although it seems really basic stuff. And I think by the kind of the way they described this wasn't particularly clear, but I got the impression that you can kind of guide what kind of character they'll be by what actions you give them. So you can send them to take part in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and their stats will change as a result, or their outlook will change as a result. I don't know, but the end outcome of all of that is that you can choose your heir. So when your El Presidente dies, someone else will take over, and you get to choose which member of your dynasty that is. Unfortunately, it sounds like this is going to be really basic, and that is only actually a stat bonus. So certain stat bonuses will be better for certain points in the game, and so you'll need to look after certain members, but there's no kind of intrigue there by the sounds of it. You won't have certain heirs trying to kill you before their time has come, and you won't get, if you say, right, this person's going to be the heir, other members won't get pissed off about that. I want a bit more Crusader Kings if you're going to start going down the dynasty route. But yeah, it doesn't look like they're approaching that at all. And the other thing is multiplayer. Tropico 5 is the first Tropico game to include a multiplayer option, and I'm not wild about it. It feels like it's been added so they can say on the back of the box, yes, we know Tropico doesn't necessarily change all that much with each edition, but this one's got multiplayer, so that's a big feature that we can put on a tick box, and that's all I really got from what they were saying, because we weren't shown it at all, and the description they gave of the multiplayer was really vague, and so all we really know actually is that you can play cooperatively or competitively. With the cooperative stuff, they're thinking along the lines of kind of SimCity in some ways, so the various players can maybe go after different industries. Maybe one player goes for a big intensive industry, makes a lot of money, whereas the other player uses that money to keep their population really well educated and stuff. And does that work? Does that work in Tropico? Does cooperative play between multiple players work? Because you're not sharing the citizens, so if you've got this big industry and everyone's pissed off because they're working so much, and the other player has a really well-educated group of people that are happy and run around making daisy chains, is that fair? What's the incentive to work together? Why not just go and play the single player instead? The competitive stuff, however, could be more interesting, because you're all going to be based on the same island, but different cities within that island. And that would work if there is a deal of intrigue. Maybe you can work to help certain factions that are unhappy with other players, and you can kind of bring their government down around them, or influence their population in some respect. They didn't talk about any of this, which is annoying, because if this is one of your big additions to the game, why not share some information other than the fact that it does have multiplayer? Everything about that just made me feel like it might be tacked on, and that is something we've seen a number of big franchises struggle with in the past, and I can't help but feel this is going to be another example of that. Hopefully I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just being a little bit pissy because they didn't share much in that respect, but single player wise, I'm happy to see that they immediately addressed the problem I had with the series, and they're working towards fixing that. Does it need multiplayer? I don't think so, but if it doesn't harm the rest of the game, then who am I to complain? So yeah, that's Tropico 5. We will keep you informed as we learn more about the game, and of course when the game is released later on this year, we will see how many of these ideas work in practice. So yeah, until then, thank you for watching Video Gamer TV, and goodbye.